Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I live in a small, quiet town nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods. It's picturesque during the day, but at night, the place can feel different, isolated, eerie. One late November evening, I was driving home from a friend's house. It was a 40-minute drive on back roads that weave through the forest, the kind of road where your headlights are the only illumination for miles. There were no streetlights, no houses, just a seemingly endless stretch of trees and darkness. I was about halfway home when I noticed something odd in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again, movement in my backseat. It wasn't the kind of movement that screams human, it was subtle, like someone shifting slightly in their seat. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there, just an empty backseat. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to my paranoia from the creepy road. Still, I couldn't shake the unease, so I turned on the radio to fill the silence. It didn't help. Static filled the speakers, even though I had been listening to music just minutes earlier. No matter what station I tried, it was all static. As I fiddled with the radio, something caught my attention in the corner of my eye, a faint reflection in the rearview mirror. This time, it wasn't just movement, it was a shape, a figure. I froze, my heart racing. The figure was sitting directly behind me. I didn't dare turn around. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the mirror, hoping I was imagining things. But it was there, a dark, shadowy outline of a person. They weren't moving, just sitting silently, almost blending into the shadows. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by something outside. I decided not to stop or slow down. Instead, I pressed harder on the gas. The figure didn't move. It didn't react. It just was. As I neared the outskirts of the forest, the shape began to shift. Slowly, it leaned forward, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its face, or lack thereof. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was nothing. Just an empty, dark void. At that moment, my headlights caught a deer darting across the road. I swerved, narrowly missing it, and came to a screeching halt on the side of the road. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. When I finally gathered the courage to look in the backseat, it was empty. No shadow, no figure, nothing. The radio was back to normal, playing a soft rock station. I sat there for a moment, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was tired, maybe it was a trick of my mind, but here's the part that still gives me chills. When I got home, I went to grab my bag from the backseat, and there it was, a single muddy handprint smeared across the middle seat. For weeks after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I tried to brush it off as a hallucination or my imagination running wild, but the handprint, it was real. I even took a photo of it, just in case I needed proof for myself later. I showed the picture to my friend, the one I'd been visiting that night, and they looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief. "That's weird," they said, handing my phone back. "But, like, maybe you leaned on the seat earlier and just didn't notice." "Maybe," I said, though I knew I hadn't. The print wasn't mine. It was too big, the fingers longer and thinner than any human hand I'd ever seen. Still, I tried to move on. I avoided that forest road entirely, opting for the longer, well-lit highway route home from then on. Life returned to normal, for the most part, until about a month later. It was late December, just a few days before Christmas. I had been out running errands and stayed out later than I'd planned. By the time I headed home, it was dark, and the highway was deserted. The air was bitterly cold, and a light dusting of snow had started to fall, making the road slick. As I drove, I felt it again, that inexplicable sensation of being watched. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I resisted the urge to glance in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see anything. I couldn't see anything, not again. But the feeling grew stronger, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I finally gave in and looked. The back seat was empty, but the reflection in the mirror showed something else, movement, this time outside the car. There was something running alongside my car. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as I strained to see through the snowflakes swirling in the headlights, I realized it wasn't. It was tall and humanoid, keeping pace with my car as if it weighed nothing. It wasn't running on the road. It was moving through the trees, leaping effortlessly from one to the next, its limbs unnaturally long and bent at odd angles. Every few seconds, it would stop and turn its head toward me, as if it were making sure I was still watching. Panic surged through me, and I floored the gas. My tires skidded on the icy road, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. I didn't look at the trees again, didn't check the mirror. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, white-knuckling the wheel until I finally saw the familiar lights of my neighborhood. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, catching my breath. The house was dark. My family family was out visiting relatives, but I didn't feel alone. The sensation of being watched lingered, like whatever had been with me on the road hadn't left. I stepped out of the car cautiously, glancing around the yard and the street. Everything was still. The only sound was the faint crunch of snow under my boots. But then I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were massive, elongated, and clawed, leading from the driver's side of my car to the edge of the woods. They stopped abruptly at the tree line, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. In fact, I didn't sleep well for weeks. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the windows set me on edge. I kept the blinds closed and avoided the woods at all costs. I never saw it again, whatever it was. But every so often, when I'm driving at night and the road is quiet, I get that feeling, that weight, that sense that I'm not alone. Months passed, and life slowly crept back toward normal. The memory of that night still lingered like a stain, but I told myself it was over. Whatever had followed me had lost interest, or at least, that's what I hoped. But then, in late spring, something happened that made me question everything. I had started going on evening walks to clear my mind. The days were getting longer, and the warmer weather made it easier to push the memories of the winter behind me. My route took me through a small park on the edge of town, a peaceful place with walking trails that wound through open fields and sparse patches of trees. It felt safe, far removed from the oppressive woods of the backroads. One evening, just before dusk, I was walking along one of the trails when I noticed something out of place. A single, muddy footprint in the middle of the path. It was large, elongated, and clawed, just like the ones I'd seen outside my car months ago. I stopped cold, my stomach dropping. I glanced around, but the trail was empty. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the silence was pressing in on me. I wanted to turn back, but something compelled me to keep going. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it was just a coincidence, that my mind was playing tricks on me again. As I continued down the path, I saw more prints scattered in the dirt and weaving in and out of the trees. They seemed to circle the trail, as if whatever had made them had been watching people pass by, keeping its distance but never straying too far. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and thin across the path. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but deep down, I knew better. I was almost back to the park entrance when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a hiss. It was close, too close. I spun around, but the trail behind me was empty. The sound came again, this time from the trees to my right. I caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of something dark slipping between the trunks. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I couldn't see them. My legs moved before my brain did, and I broke into a full sprint, running toward the safety of the streetlights and the distant hum of cars. The growl followed me, growing louder, more insistent, like it was right on my heels. When I finally reached the park entrance, I risked a glance back. The trail was empty, the trees still. But there, just at the edge of the shadows, I saw it, a shape hunched low to the ground, its limbs impossibly long, its face still that same featureless void. It didn't move. It didn't follow. It just watched as I stumbled backward onto the sidewalk, my chest heaving with terror. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting for it to come closer. It never did. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and didn't sleep at all that night. Since then, I've stopped walking in the evenings. I've avoided the park, the back roads, anywhere even remotely isolated, but the thing is, I still feel it sometimes. When I'm home alone at night, or when I'm driving and the road gets too quiet. That weight, that pressure, that inescapable sense of being watched. I was in college at the time, and the library was my go-to spot for studying. It was an old building, 3 stories high, with creaky floors and walls lined with dusty shelves of books that no one touched anymore. My favorite spot was a tucked-away corner on the 2nd floor where I could spread out my notes in peace. One night, I stayed later than usual to cram for an exam. By 10 p.m., most of the other students had cleared out. The place was dead silent, except for the occasional groan of the old pipes. I decided to take a break and go grab some water. The library had a small break area, but the vending machines were in the basement. I'd only been to the basement once or twice before. It was mostly used for storage and old records. The lights down there were dim, buzzing fluorescent tubes that flickered every so often. As I descended the stairs, I felt a chill that made me wrap my jacket tighter around myself. When I got to the bottom, I noticed the air was heavier, like the basement hadn't been aired out in years. The vending machines were tucked in a corner, past rows of forgotten books and ancient filing cabinets. I fed my dollar into the machine and hit the button for a water bottle. As the bottle clung plunked into the tray, I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't mine. I was standing still. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. My heart started to race, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a janitor or another student. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No response. The footsteps stopped. I grabbed my water and turned to head back up the stairs, trying not to let my imagination get the better of me. But as I passed one of the rows of shelves, I saw her. A woman was standing there, partially hidden by the shadows. She was facing away from me, her long, matted hair hanging down her back. She was wearing a pale, tattered dress that looked like it belonged in a different century. Her arms hung limp at her sides. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Was she lost? Homeless? Sick? Are you okay? I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't move. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving her. When I reached the stairs, I turned and bolted up them two at a time. I didn't stop until I was back on the second floor, where the lights seemed brighter and the air lighter. I considered calling campus security, but I didn't even know how to explain what I'd seen. There's a creepy woman in a dress standing in the basement didn't exactly sound urgent or believable. I decided to pack up my things and leave. As I headed for the exit, I passed by the front desk where the night librarian sat. I mentioned, as casually as I could, that I thought I saw someone in the basement. The librarian frowned. No one should be down there. The basement's off limits after 8 p.m. I nodded, thanked her, and hurried out into the cool night air. I never went back to the basement after that. A few months later, I'd overheard someone else talking about seeing a strange woman down there. They described her exactly as I'd seen her, tattered dress, long hair, silent. A few weeks after the encounter, I couldn't get the memory out of my head. The image of the woman standing there, motionless, seemed to follow me wherever I went. My logical mind kept trying to find explanations. Maybe it really was someone who'd snuck in, a squatter, maybe. But there was something about the way she stood so still, so unnervingly quiet, that didn't feel human. One day, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do some digging. I figured if the basement held records, maybe it also held answers. I convinced myself it was nothing supernatural, just some quirky mystery tied to the history of the building. The library was built in the late 1800 seconds and had been part of the campus since the beginning. Surely something interesting would pop up. I started asking the staff about the library's history, but most of them didn't know much. The only person who seemed to have any real information was the head librarian, a woman named Mrs. Calder. She was older, in her late 60s, and had worked at the library for over 30 years. When I casually mentioned the basement and the woman I'd seen, her face went pale. She gave me a long, hard look before shaking her head. You shouldn't be going down there, she said quietly. It's not safe. Not safe. Why? I pressed. Mrs. Calder hesitated, then leaned in, lowering her voice. Years ago, back when I first started here, we used to let students use the basement for studying. But strange things kept happening. People reported seeing things, shadows, figures that weren't there when they turned around. Books would fall off shelves for no reason. And then, she trailed off, her eyes darting around as if someone might overhear. And then what? There was an incident, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A girl went missing. She was last seen heading into the basement. They searched for days but never found her. Eventually, the police ruled it a runaway case, but no one believed it. Not after the stories. After that, the basement was closed to the public. I felt a chill run down my spine. Did they ever figure out what happened to her? Mrs. Calder shook her head. All I know is that she's not the only one who's gone missing around here. And if I were you, I'd stay far away from that basement. I wanted to believe she was just trying to scare me, but the look in her eyes was too genuine, too afraid. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying her words in my head. Missing girl, shadows, figures that weren't there. Against my better judgment, I decided I needed to see for myself. If nothing else, I could convince myself it was just my imagination. The next evening, I waited until the library was nearly empty. I brought a flashlight with me just in case. When I reached the basement door, I paused, my hand hovering over the handle. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and descended the stairs. The air felt heavier than before, almost suffocating. My flashlight beam cut through the dimness, revealing rows of dusty shelves and forgotten furniture. I walked slowly, listening for any sounds. At first, there was nothing but the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, but as I moved deeper into the basement, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the space. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just the sound of the footsteps getting closer. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the shelves, and then I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the aisle, just as before, her back to me. Only this time, she was closer, much closer. Who are you? I managed to choke out. She moved, not her bodies, but her head. It turned ever so slowly until I could see the side of her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those eyes, were black pits staring straight through me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran faster than than I ever had in my life, up the stairs and out of the library. I didn't stop until I was back in my dorm room, shaking and gasping for breath. That was the last time I set foot in that library. A part of me wanted to report what I'd seen, but who would believe me? Over the years, I've heard whispers from other students about strange things in the library, but no one ever stays long enough to find out the truth. A few years passed, and I tried to push the experience out of my mind. I graduated, moved to a different city, and started a new job. Life went on, but every now and then, I'd find myself thinking about that library and the woman in the basement. I told a few close friends about it, but they just laughed it off as a creepy college story or an overactive imagination. I almost convinced myself that they were right until something strange happened. One night, I was scrolling through social media when I came across a post from my old university. It was an announcement that the library was undergoing renovations, including the basement. They were planning to expand it into a modern study lounge. The post included photos of the construction work, and as I stared at them, a cold sense of dread washed over me. In one of the photos, taken deep in the basement, I saw a shadowy figure standing in the background. It was faint, almost like a trick of the light, but it looked eerily familiar. Too familiar. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The renovations were scheduled to be completed within a few months, and the thought of people gathering in that space, laughing, studying, oblivious to what might be lingering there, made my skin crawl. About a week later, I got an email from one of my old college friends, Erica. She worked at the university now, in the alumni office, and we stayed in touch sporadically. Her message was short, but it made my blood run cold. Hey, do you remember that creepy story you told me about the library basement? Weird stuff is happening during the renovation. Workers are refusing to go back down there. They say they're hearing voices and seeing things move on their own. Thought you'd find it interesting. Let me know if you want to catch up. I didn't reply. I didn't want to talk about it, but I couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the basement and the strange things Erica mentioned. Against my better judgment, I started digging for more information. I checked forums, social media, and even obscure blogs about campus legends. What I found only made things worse. There were more stories that I'd never heard while I was a student. A janitor who quit after hearing a woman's voice singing softly in the basement late at night. A professor who claimed she felt someone grab her arm when no one else was around. Students who reported seeing shadows darting between the shelves. And the most unsettling one, an old campus newspaper article from the 1970s about a seance held in the library by a group of students. The article didn't say much, but it mentioned that something went wrong. Very wrong. The deeper I dug, the more convinced I became that the library wasn't just haunted, it was dangerous. I wanted to warn Erica, but what could I say? That she should stay away from the basement because I had a bad feeling. She'd laugh me off. A few weeks later, I got another email from her. This time, the subject line read, "They found something." Her message was short again, but this time, it included an attachment, a blurry photo of what looked like an old wooden door, heavily padlocked, that the construction workers had uncovered behind one of the basement walls. According to Erica, no one knew it was there. The university was calling in a historical consultant to figure out what it was, but rumors were already flying around campus. Something told me that door was the source of everything. The shadows, the voices, the woman. I wanted to forget about it, to leave it all in the past, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was behind it. A week later, Erica called me. She sounded shaken. They opened the door, she said, her voice trembling. There was a room. It was small, barely big enough to stand in, but there were markings all over the walls, symbols, words in a language no one could read. And on the floor, they found, she paused, taking a shaky breath. They found bones, human bones. I didn't say anything. What could I say? They think it's connected to that missing girl, Erica continued, but I don't think it's all. There's something else, something wrong. The workers refuse to go near it now. They're saying they're seeing her, the woman you described. She's there, just standing outside the door, watching. That was the last time I spoke to Erica. The university shut down the renovations shortly after, citing structural concerns, but I know that wasn't the real reason. Whatever they uncovered in that basement, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. I've moved on with my life as best I can, but sometimes, late at night, I still think about her. The woman in the basement. I don't know who or what she was, but I know one thing for sure, some doors should never be opened. I was living in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old brick building at the time. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was quiet, and I liked that. The neighborhood was mostly families and retirees, and there wasn't much foot traffic aside from people walking their dogs or kids riding bikes. One night, I was watching TV around 10 p.m. when I heard a strange sound outside. It was faint, almost like a baby crying. At first, I thought it was just my neighbor's TV, but then it got louder and more distinct, like a cat meowing, but drawn out, and I went to the window and looked down at at the street. There wasn't anyone there, just the glow of the street lights and empty parked cars. The sound stopped, and I figured the cat had moved on. About an hour later, I was brushing my teeth, getting ready for bed, when I heard it again. This time, it sounded like it was coming from right outside my door. I froze, toothpaste foam still in my mouth, and just listened. It wasn't a normal meow. It was low, guttural, and almost human-like. I live on the 3rd floor. There's no way a cat could have climbed up there, but curiosity got the better of me. I spat out the toothpaste, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door. The hallway was empty. No cat, no person, nothing. But as soon as I stepped out, I heard it again, louder this time, like it was just around the corner. I don't know what possessed me to follow it, but I did. I walked down the hall, flashlight in hand, toward the sound. When I turned the corner, the meowing stopped abruptly, and that's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, there was a cat, or at least, I thought it was a cat. It was pitch black, with glowing yellow eyes that didn't reflect the light from my flashlight the way they should have. It just sat there, staring at me, perfectly still. "Hey, kitty," I said softly, trying to sound calm. It didn't move. Its eyes didn't blink. I took a step closer, and the thing stood up. Not like a cat, like a person. Its front legs, or arms, I guess, stretched unnaturally long, and its back arched in a way that made my stomach turn. It didn't walk or run. It just glided toward me. I panicked and bolted back to my apartment, slamming the door shut and locking it. My heart was racing as I backed away, flashlight shaking in my hand. Then I heard it again, the meow, but this time, it was coming from inside my apartment. I didn't even think. I grabbed my phone and ran out of there, not stopping until I was in my car. I drove to a friend's place and stayed the night there, making up some excuse about my plumbing flooding or something. I never told her the real reason. The next day, I went back to my apartment, dreading what I might find, but everything was normal. No sign of the cat, or whatever it was. I even asked my neighbors if they'd heard anything weird the night before. They all said no. I moved out a few months later. For a while, I tried to convince myself it was some sort of weird dream. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe the sound I heard was a stray cat that somehow got in. But the way it moved, I couldn't shake that. It wasn't normal. Even after I moved to a new apartment in a completely different neighborhood, I found myself jumping at little noises, scratches on the wall, wind rattling the windows, things like that. I'd always double check my locks and sleep with the light on, just in case. A few months after I moved, I started to feel normal again. No weird noises, no creepy feelings, no. Think in the hallway, life went on. I stopped telling people about it because, honestly, their skepticism made me doubt myself. But then, about 6 months ago, something happened that made it all come rushing back. I was walking home late after dinner with a friend. It was about 11 p.m. and the streets were quiet. The only sound was the faint buzz of streetlights and the occasional hum of a passing car. As I turned the corner onto my street, I heard it again, the meow. That same, drawn-out, guttural sound. My stomach dropped. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe a normal cat had me paranoid. But the closer I got to my building, the louder it got. When I reached my front steps, it stopped. I froze, staring at my door, waiting for something. I don't know what. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just a stray, and forced myself to go inside. My new apartment was on the 2nd floor of a small building. No hallways, just a set of stairs leading to my door. As I climbed the stairs, I felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I looked over my shoulder, and there it was. The black cat was sitting at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at me. Its eyes still didn't reflect light. They just glowed faintly, like embers. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I tried to tell myself to run, to get inside and lock the door, but I couldn't move. I was frozen. Then it did that horrible thing again. It stood up, its limbs stretching and bending in ways they shouldn't. It tilted its head, almost like it was amused, and took one gliding step toward me. That broke the spell. I ran up the stairs, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. I didn't even bother turning on the lights. I just hid in the corner of my living room, clutching my phone, too scared to call anyone because I didn't want to make a sound. I sat there for hours, straining to hear anything outside, but it was silent. No footsteps, no scratching, nothing. When the sun finally came up, I mustered the courage to peek out the window. There was no sign of the thing, just the quiet, empty street. I called out of work that day and spent it researching, trying to figure out what it could have been. I looked up stories about shadow people, cryptids, and even folklore about black cats, but nothing quite matched what I saw. Since that night, I've been carrying salt in my pocket and a small iron charm on my keychain, just in case. I don't know if they'll do anything, but they make me feel a little safer. I haven't seen it again, but I know it's not gone. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear faint scratching at my window or what sounds like a meow in the distance. I've tried to move on with my life, but it feels like whatever this thing is, it's not letting me. For months after that last encounter, I lived on edge. I kept my curtains drawn at all times, checked my locks multiple times before before bed and avoided walking outside at night. My friends started noticing my paranoia, and I ended up telling one of them about it, just the broad strokes, leaving out the weirder details. She laughed it off, saying I probably watched too many horror movies, but she did suggest getting a security camera for peace of mind. I liked the idea, so I bought one of those small indoor cameras that connect to your phone. I set it up at my living room, facing the window. If anything came near my apartment again, I wanted proof, or at least some warning. For weeks, nothing happened. I started to relax a little, convincing myself that whatever I'd seen was gone for good. But one night, I woke up to a notification on my phone, motion detected. My heart started pounding as I grabbed my phone and opened the app. At first, the screen was just a grainy view of my dark living room. I was about to dismiss it as a glitch when I noticed something near the window. A shadow. It was subtle, just barely visible against the curtain, but it was there, and it was moving. I stared at the screen, unable to breathe. The shadow shifted slowly, like it was pacing back and forth. Then it stopped, and for a second, everything was still. And then, the meow, clear as day, coming through the camera's audio. That horrible, low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. The shadow on the screen seemed to swell, growing larger until it filled the entire frame. Then the feed cut out. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? What would I even say? That a shadow cat thing was stalking me. Instead, I grabbed the salt I'd been keeping, poured a line across my door and windowsills, and sat on the floor clutching my phone. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun came up, I checked the camera again. The feed was back to normal, but there was no recording of what I'd seen. Just a gap in the footage, like it had never happened. I tried to convince myself to stay, to not let this thing ruin my life. But the truth is, I was too scared. Within a week, I broke my lease, packed up, and moved in with a cousin across the state. I didn't tell her why, just that I needed a fresh start. For a while, things were quiet. I started to feel normal again, like maybe I'd left it behind. But last night, it happened again. I was in my cousin's backyard, letting her dog out before bed, when I heard it. That same horrible meow, echoing from the woods behind her house. The dog froze, its ears perked up, and let out a low growl. I didn't wait to see if anything occurred. I grabbed the dog and ran inside, locking the door behind me. Now, I don't know what to do. It's followed me across the state. I don't think it's going to stop. I don't think it can stop. And the worst part is, I don't know what it wants. If anyone has any idea what this could be or how to make it go away, please let me know. I'm scared it's only a matter of time before it gets inside again. And next time, I might not be so lucky. A few years ago, I worked part-time at a small boutique in our local mall. It wasn't one of those huge malls with endless corridors. It was more modest, with just a few anchor stores and a food court. My shifts often ran late, as we stayed open until 9 p.m., but I usually felt safe since the mall security was pretty diligent. One evening, I was closing the store by myself. My coworker had left earlier because she wasn't feeling well, so it was just me. As I counted the till and straightened up the displays, I noticed a man lingering just outside the glass storefront. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just standing there, staring through the glass. At first, I thought he might just be waiting for someone, but as I continued my closing routine, I realized he wasn't moving. He was watching me. His face was blank, expressionless in a way that sent a chill down my spine. Trying to brush it off, I locked the door and flipped off the main lights, hoping that would signal him to move on. It didn't. Instead, as I grabbed my bag and headed toward the employee exit, I saw him fall into step behind me. The mall was practically empty at this point. Most of the stores had already closed, and the few remaining employees were scattered across the sprawling layout. I quickened my pace, clutching my bag tightly. The man kept following me, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. I glanced over my shoulder, and his eyes locked onto mine. There was something off about him. His movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, and he didn't seem to blink. I ducked into a side hallway that led to the staff restrooms, hoping to lose him. After waiting a few moments, I peeked out. The hallway seemed empty, and I let out a shaky breath. I decided to head straight to the security office, just to be safe. As I turned the corner, I almost screamed. He was there, standing a few feet away, blocking my path. I hadn't heard his footsteps. He was just there. "You forgot something," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He held out his hand, but it was empty. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, backing away. His expression twisted into a grin, and he took a step closer. "You'll remember soon enough." Before I could respond, another set of footsteps approached. A mall security guard appeared at the end of the hallway, and the man immediately backed off, slinking into the shadows nose without another word. I ran to the guard, explaining what had happened, but by the time we returned to the hallway, the man was gone. Security reviewed the footage from the cameras, but here's the creepy part, they couldn't find him. The cameras outside my store, in the hallways, even near the staff restrooms. There was no trace of him. For a while after that night, I avoided the mall altogether. I took some time off work, and when I returned, I only worked day shifts. My manager was sympathetic when I explained what had happened, but I could tell she thought I was overreacting. Things seemed to go back to normal. I told myself it was just a weird guy playing a creepy prank or trying to intimidate me. Maybe the cameras just glitched, or maybe security didn't look hard enough. I wanted to believe that. For a while, I almost did. Then, about a month later, I was walking to my car after a Saturday afternoon shift. The parking lot was crowded, filled with shoppers heading home for the evening. As I approached my car, I noticed something tucked under the windshield wiper. It was a small, folded piece of paper. My heart sank as I unfolded it. Written in messy, jagged handwriting was a single sentence. "I told you, remember?" I froze, clutching the note in my hands, scanning the parking lot. Dozens of people were coming and going, but no one stood out. No one was watching me, or at least, not that I could tell. I called mall security and showed them the note. They checked the parking lot cameras this time, and sure enough, they caught someone on video. The footage showed a man approaching my car, slipping the note under the wiper, and walking off. The angle wasn't great, but I recognized him immediately. It was him. The way he moved on the footage was the same, that jerky, unsettling gait, like he wasn't quite in control of his limbs. But then came the worst part. The moment when he turned toward the camera, his face was pale, his eyes wide, unblinking, and even though the footage was silent, you could almost feel the weight of his grin. Security said they'd keep an eye out, but they couldn't do much without knowing who he was or what he wanted. I filed a police report, but they didn't have much to go on, either. No name, no clear motive, just a creepy guy who somehow knew where I worked and what car I drove. I stopped working at the boutique not long after that. I couldn't handle the anxiety of walking through the mall alone anymore. For months, I avoided public places altogether. I kept expecting him to show up again, outside my house, at the grocery store, anywhere. Thankfully, he never did. At least, not that I know of. I thought I was finally moving past it, until a few weeks ago. I had mostly put the experience behind me. Life had gotten back to normal. Work, friends, the occasional outing. I had convinced myself that it was over, that maybe the man had just been some unhinged stranger who moved on to someone else or gave up on whatever his creepy intentions were. But then I started noticing something. It began small. One day, I noticed my kitchen window was slightly open when I was sure I had closed it. Another time, I came home to find the throw blanket on my couch had been moved, not in a way that suggested it had just slid off, but as if someone had sat there. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I hadn't closed the window all the way, or maybe I'd just forgotten I'd moved the blanket. But the feeling of being watched crept back in. That same prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was just out of sight, staring. And then, 2 nights ago, it happened again. I was watching TV in my living room, curled up with a cup of tea, when I heard a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the sliding glass door that led to my small backyard. I froze, staring at the door. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping was deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I wanted to believe it was a tree branch or maybe an animal, but deep down, I knew better. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, pulling the curtain aside just a fraction. My heart dropped. There he was. He was standing just outside the glass, his face inches from the door. That same pale skin, those unblinking eyes, that sickening grin. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. "There's a man at my back door," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The operator assured me police were on their way. I glanced back at the door. He was still there, but now he was tilting his head, like he was studying me. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed at me, then dragged his finger across his throat in a slow, deliberate motion. I ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The police arrived quickly, but by the time they searched the backyard, he was gone. The officers told me there were no footprints in the yard, which didn't make sense. It had rained earlier that evening, and the ground was still soft. They tried to reassure me, but I could tell they were just as unnerved as I was. "Val, I'm staying with a friend. I don't feel safe in my own home anymore. I don't know how he found me again, or why he's doing this. All I know is that he's not done. I keep thinking about what he said the first night we met. You forgot something, you'll remember soon enough." I used to work as a night shift janitor at an office building. It was one of those modern, glass and steel structures downtown that stay eerily quiet after business hours. I was typically the only one in the building after 8 p.m., aside from the occasional late working executive or security guard making rounds. The pay was decent, and I didn't mind the solitude until one night made me question everything. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was finishing up on the 12th floor. This particular floor was mostly empty, save for a few offices on one end and a large conference room with glass walls on the other. As I was vacuuming near the elevators, I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the glass doors leading to the conference room. At first, I assumed it was just my own reflection or maybe a trick of the light, but when I looked closer, I saw a figure standing just inside the conference room, staring directly at me. They were tall, dressed in dark clothing, and completely still. The glass distorted their features, so I couldn't make out a face. I froze. The building was supposed to be locked after 8 p.m., and security had already done their rounds. I turned off the vacuum, thinking maybe it was a late working employee who I hadn't noticed earlier. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing down the silent corridor. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there. My stomach dropped. I wasn't sure what to do, so I decided to head toward the conference room to get a better look. As I approached, the figure moved, not toward me, but sideways, out of view, deeper into the room. My heart was pounding, but I kept walking, convincing myself it had to be a harmless explanation. When I reached the doors, I cautiously opened one and peeked inside. The room was empty. There were no other exits except the one I'd just come through. The only things in the room were a long table, a few chairs, and a projector mounted on the ceiling. I even checked under the table and behind the chairs, but there was no one there. I was completely freaked out, but I tried to shake it off as my imagination. I left the conference room, locked the door, and went back to cleaning. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About an hour later, I was on the 15th floor, cleaning the kitchenette. I glanced up at the window and nearly screamed. That same figure was standing outside the glass, on the ledge, 15 stories above the ground. Their face was pressed against the window, but it wasn't a face, it was just a blank, featureless surface where a face should be. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in the process. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear the glass move, nothing. Just silence. That was the last straw. I grabbed my things and left the building, leaving the rest of my shift unfinished. I told my boss I had a family emergency and couldn't work nights anymore. They didn't press me for details, and I didn't offer any. For months after I left the job, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I told myself it was a trick of the light or maybe stress getting to me, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw that night was real. The nightmares started shortly after I moved. In them, I was back in that building, walking the silent halls. The figure was always there, just out of reach, watching me through the glass. Sometimes, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'd see it standing in my room. Thankfully, I never did. At least, not at first. One night, about 3 months after I left the job, I was sitting on my couch, binge watching a TV show. It was past midnight, and my apartment was dark except for the glow of the screen. I lived on the 3rd floor, and my windows faced a quiet alley. It was a peaceful place, and I'd never felt unsafe there, until I saw it again. At first, I thought it was a shadow. Something outside must have cast it, maybe a passing car or a stray cat on the fire escape. But then I realized the figure wasn't moving. It was standing perfectly still, just outside the window, staring in at me. My blood ran cold. It was the same as before, tall, featureless, and utterly silent. It didn't press its face to the glass this time, but I could feel its gaze, even without eyes. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, but as soon as I turned my head to grab it, the figure was gone. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. I told myself it was just leftover fear from that night at the office building. My mind played tricks on me. But as the days went on, strange things started happening. I'd wake up to find my apartment door unlocked, even though I was sure I bolted it before bed. My keys would go missing, only to reappear in strange places, once in the freezer, another time inside my shoe. Lights I'd turned off would be on when I came home, and the air in my apartment always felt heavy, like I wasn't alone. The final straw came about a week later. I'd installed blackout curtains in my bedroom to help me sleep, and they did a good job of keeping the room pitch dark. One night, I woke up suddenly, my heart racing for no apparent reason. As I blinked into the darkness, I saw it. The figure was standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just lay there, paralyzed, as it stood there, unmoving. It didn't make a sound, didn't come closer, it just watched. Finally, I managed to reach for the lamp on my bedside table. As soon as the light flooded the room, the figure was gone. I packed a bag that night and left. I didn't care where I went, I just couldn't stay there anymore. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch for a few days while I figured out what to do. Eventually, I moved again, this time to a new city, far away from everything. Even after moving and putting distance between myself and those encounters, the fear figure lingered. The figure was gone, but its presence felt burned into my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. Therapy helped to some extent. I told my therapist the sanitized version of events, just enough to sound like stress-induced paranoia without coming across as entirely unhinged. She chalked it up to trauma and recommended grounding techniques to ease my anxiety. For a while, life felt endless normally. I got a new job, made new friends, and began to settle into my routine. But the figure never really left my thoughts. It became a quiet undercurrent in my life, lurking in my subconscious. I'd double check locks, avoid looking too long into windows at night, and always keep a light on when I slept. It was around this time that the dreams began again. Only this time, they weren't confined to the old office building. In these dreams, I'd be in my new apartment or walking the streets of my new neighborhood, and the figure would be there, standing just far enough away to make me question if it was real. Sometimes it would move closer, but never quickly. It was always slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat after one of these dreams. It was 3:33 a.m. exactly. My phone buzzed on my nightstand, startling me. It was a notification, a missed call from an unknown number. I stared at the screen, trying to shake the grogginess, and then it buzzed again. Another call. The number was blocked this time. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned off my phone and lay there, staring at the ceiling, heart racing. After what felt like an eternity, I must have drifted back to sleep because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, I felt relief until I saw my phone lying on the nightstand, screen cracked as though it had been slammed onto the floor. I didn't remember touching it after turning it off. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening again. Footsteps in the hall when no one was there. Objects moved from where I left them. Once, I came home to find the mirror in my bathroom shattered, with the words "We see you" scrawled in the condensation on the glass. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I reached out to the only person I thought might understand, a former security guard from the office building. We'd exchanged numbers once in passing, and I never expected him to pick up, but he did. When I explained what I'd been experiencing, there was a long pause on the other end. Finally, he said, "You're not the first." He told me that over the years, several people have reported strange encounters in that building. Shadows moving where they shouldn't, whispers in empty rooms, even sightings of a tall, faceless figure. Some claimed it followed them after they left, though no one had ever been able to explain why. "Do you know what it is?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it is, it's attached to you now." I didn't know what to say. He told me to try cleansing rituals, prayers, anything that might break the connection. I tried everything he suggested, burning sage, leaving bowls of salt in every room, even consulting with a spiritual medium. For a while, it seemed to work. The noises stopped, the dreams faded, and I almost convinced myself it was over. Until last night, I was walking home from work, taking a shortcut through a quiet park. The air was cool, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. I glanced around, enjoying the stillness, until I noticed something. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. I froze. It was the same as before, tall, featureless, and utterly still. My breath hitched, and I fought the urge to run, knowing instinctively it would follow. Instead, I turned slowly and walked away, keeping my eyes forward. I could feel its presence behind me, closing the distance with every step. When I reached the street, I finally dared to look back. The park was empty. I don't know what it wants, or why it won't leave me alone. All I know is that it's patient, and it's always there, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. And one day, I'm afraid it won't just be watching anymore. I live in a small town with a nature preserve that has a popular trail loop. It's the kind of place where people go jogging, walk their dogs, or just clear their heads. It's usually pretty busy during the day, but I decided to go later in the evening because I wanted some quiet. The trail is a 2-mile loop that winds through the woods, and at a certain point, you're completely surrounded by trees with no sight of the parking lot or the main road. That's where this encounter happened. I'd been walking for about 15 minutes when I noticed it. At first, I couldn't put my finger on what was bothering me, but then I realized it had gotten completely silent. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, just nothing. That's weird in itself, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence. Then, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. You know that sensation when you're sure someone is watching you. It crept up on me, and no matter how much I told myself I was being paranoid, I couldn't shake it. I glanced behind me. Nothing, just the empty trail stretching back into the trees. I picked up my pace, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. I told myself I was just imagining things. Maybe I'd read too many creepy stories online. but then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves off to my left, deeper in the woods. I froze and scanned the trees. At first, I didn't see anything, but then a movement caught my eye. Someone, tall, wearing dark clothes, was standing about 20 feet into the trees, just watching me. They didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, partially obscured by the shadows. Hello, I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. They didn't even flinch. I started walking again, faster this time, but I could hear the sound of leaves crunching, matching my pace. Whoever they were following me but staying off the trail. At this point, I was panicking. I didn't want to outright run and make it obvious that I was scared, but I was speed walking as fast as I could without breaking into a jog. Every so often, I'd hear another crunch, always keeping pace with me. When I finally saw the break in the trees where the parking lot was, I felt a rush of relief until I glanced back one last time. The figure was standing at the edge of the trail now, completely visible. They were tall, wearing what looked like a hoodie with the hood up. I couldn't see their face. They just stood there, not moving, watching me. I ran the rest of the way to my car, fumbling with my keys and practically throwing myself inside. As I locked the doors, I glanced back at the trail. The figure was gone. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down before finally driving home. I never reported it because, honestly, what would I have said? That someone stood in the woods and creeped me out. I haven't been back to that trail since. The experience left me shaken for weeks, but I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it was just some random person messing around. I told myself. It wasn't until a couple of months later that I realized how wrong I was. I was scrolling through my local community Facebook group when a post caught my eye. A woman was warning others about a strange man she had seen while jogging on the same trail. Her description was eerily similar to what I'd seen. Tall, dark hoodie, staying just off the path and watching without saying a word. She said she reported it to the park rangers, but they didn't find anyone when they searched the area. That post brought everything back, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a one-off encounter. I started checking the group more often, and over the next several months, similar stories started popping up. People described the same figure, always keeping their distance, always silent, and always disappearing before anyone could confront them. One post really got under my skin. A man shared that he'd been hiking the trail just before sunset when he felt someone watching him. He turned around and saw the figure just like I had, but when he shouted at them, the person started moving, running deeper into the woods. The man said he followed for a short distance but stopped when he realized how far they were going into the trees. It felt like they were trying to lure me out there, he wrote. That sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just creepy behavior anymore, it felt calculated. The breaking point for me came when a friend of mine, Sarah, told me her own story. She'd heard about my experience but brushed it off, thinking it was exaggerated. She loved the trail and refused to stop going. One evening, she decided to do the loop solo, just like I had. About halfway through, she said she felt the same eerie silence I described, like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then she saw the figure not just standing off the path, but crouched low in the bushes as if trying to stay hidden. She didn't stick around to investigate. She turned and ran, not stopping until she reached the parking lot. The worst part, when she got to her car, there was a piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. It just said, "See you soon." That was it for both of us. I convinced her to report it, and the park officials promised to look into it, but nothing ever came of it. To this day, people in our town still post about strange encounters on that trail. Some have started referring to the figure as the trail watcher, like some kind of local legend. After Sarah's experience, the unease in our small town grew. The park trail became less popular, especially in the evenings. But the sightings didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. The local authorities dismissed it as a prank or someone trying to scare people off, but those of us who'd encountered the figure knew better. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they operated, always just out of reach, always silent, always vanishing the moment you tried to confront them. They felt too deliberate to be a prank. Then came the incident that changed everything. A young man named Eric, who worked as a delivery driver in town, decided to take his dog for a walk on the trail late one afternoon. He wasn't the type to scare easily and laughed off the stories about the trail watcher. According to his girlfriend, he even joked about wanting to see what all the fuss was about. Eric didn't come home that night. His girlfriend reported him missing the next morning when she woke up and realized he hadn't returned. His car was still parked at the trailhead, but there was no sign of him or his dog. Search parties combed the woods for days. They found his dog first, tied to a tree about a mile off the trail. The poor thing was terrified but unharmed. They found Eric 2 days later. He was alive but barely conscious, lying in a shallow ditch deep in the woods. His clothes were torn, and he was covered in scratches and bruises. The search team said it looked like he'd been running blindly through the underbrush, but what was most disturbing was his state of mind. Eric wouldn't, or couldn't, say what had happened to him. He just kept muttering the same thing over and over. "It's not a man. It's not a man." He was taken to the hospital, but after a few days, his family transferred him to a mental health facility. He still hasn't spoken about what he saw, and the few times people have tried to bring it up, he gets agitated and refuses to talk. The authorities doubled down on their stance that there was nothing to fear, claiming Eric must have had some kind of psychotic break or been attacked by a wild animal. But no one bought that explanation, not after everything that had already happened. The trail is mostly abandoned now. A few brave, or foolish, people still go, usually during the busiest parts of the day. But there are no guarantees. The trail watcher doesn't have a pattern. They don't care if it's daylight or dark, busy or empty. If they decide to appear, they will. I've heard whispers about people organizing groups to go out and find whatever or whoever is behind the sightings. But honestly, I think it's a bad idea. Whatever this thing is, it isn't something you want to mess with. Eric's encounter proved that much. I've moved on from that town, but every once in a while, I check the community Facebook group to see if there are any updates. The stories keep coming, and they're getting stranger. Some people claim to hear whispers in the woods, like voices calling their names. Others report seeing multiple figures now, not just one. I don't know what's happening on that trail, and I don't want to know. All I can say is this: if you're ever in a small town with a quiet nature preserve and a 2-mile loop trail, maybe think twice before you go for a walk. And if you hear the forest go silent, or you feel eyes on you where there shouldn't be any, leave. Don't wait to see what or who is out there. There's an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of my town, a massive, crumbly relic that's been shut down for decades. Growing up, everyone heard the rumors it was haunted, used for cult rituals, or home to squatters. But the truth, no one really knew. It was a place you avoided unless you were a thrill-seeking teenager, or in my case, someone who took a dare a little too seriously. A few friends and I were hanging out one night, trading stories about local legends. Someone brought up the hospital and dared me to walk through it alone. Feeling bold, I accepted. They gave me a flashlight and waited outside while I stepped through the broken front doors. The air inside was stale and damp. Graffiti covered the walls, and debris was scattered everywhere. My flashlight flickered, illuminating peeling paint and shattered windows. It was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the building settling. I told myself it was fine. Nothing supernatural was going to happen. It was just an old building. But as I moved deeper, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew colder, and I swear I heard faint whispers. I stopped and listened, but the sound faded, leaving only the pounding of my heart. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway was a doorway leading into what must have been an old operating room. The faint glow of moonlight streamed in through a broken window, illuminating the room just enough to see shapes inside. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer. As I stepped into the room, the first thing I noticed was the gurney in the center, rusted and covered in grime. But what froze me in place was the figure standing in the far corner. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. There was someone there, hunched over, facing the wall. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, motionless. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I took a step closer. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural humming sound, almost like a chant. It wasn't coming from the figure, but seemed to echo all around me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. Before I could move, the figure shifted. Slowly, it turned its head toward me. I'll never forget the face, pale, with empty, blackened eyes and a twisted grin that seemed to stretch too wide. The humming grew louder, and I swear the shadows in the room started to move, creeping toward me like they were alive. I read, and I didn't care about the noise I made or whether I tripped over debris. I sprinted down the hall, through the broken doors, and into the safety of the night. My friends laughed when they saw me, thinking I was just spooked by the dark, but I couldn't even speak. I just pointed to the car, and we left. I haven't been back to that hospital since. Sometimes I think about what I saw and try to convince myself it was just a squatter or a weird shadow. But deep down, I know that whatever was in that room was a human, and it wasn't alone. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone anymore. It started small, little things I chalked up to paranoia. My bedroom door, which I always closed, would be slightly ajar when I woke up. My keys, left on the kitchen counter, would somehow end up on the coffee table. It was enough to unsettle me, but not enough to convince me something was wrong. Then came the dreams. Every night, I'd find myself back in that hospital, wandering its endless halls. The walls seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in impossible ways. And no matter which direction I went, I'd always end up back in that operating room. The figure would be there, waiting, humming that same awful tune. It would smile at me with that too wide grin, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. After a particularly bad night, I confided in my friend Rachel, the only one who seemed to take my fears seriously. She suggested I might have picked up some sort of spiritual hitchhiker and urged me to cleanse myself and my space. It sounded ridiculous, but at that point, I was desperate for anything to make it stop. Rachel brought over sage and a bundle of candles. We performed the cleansing in my apartment, her chanting some words she googled while I nervously followed her instructions. For a moment, the air in my apartment felt lighter, and I thought maybe it worked. But that night, the dream changed. Instead of wandering the hospital, I found myself in my bedroom. Everything looked normal, except for one detail. The figure was standing in the corner, exactly where my dresser should have been. It didn't hum this time. It just stared at me with those empty eyes and that horrible grin. When it finally moved, it didn't lunge or attack. It simply raised a hand and pointed at me. I woke up to the sound of my closet door creaking open. Terrified, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. My closet was empty, just clothes and shoes, but the air in the room felt wrong, heavy, like something was watching me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I called Rachel and she suggested we visit a local medium she knew. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but at this point, I had no better options. The medium, a quiet woman named Linda, listened as I explained what happened. She didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully and asked a few questions about the hospital. When I finished, she sat in silence for a moment before saying, "You encountered something that didn't want to be found, and now it's attached to you." My stomach dropped. What do I do? Linda explained that whatever I'd seen wasn't a ghost. It was something darker, something that fed on fear. She believed it followed me because my panic during the encounter made me an easy target. She offered to perform a ritual to sever the connection, but she warned me it wouldn't be easy. The entity wouldn't want to let go. The ritual took place that evening. Linda burned herbs and drew symbols on the floor of her small shop. I sat in the center, holding a candle, while she chanted in a language I didn't recognize. As the ritual progressed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew cold, and for a brief moment, I swore I heard the humming again, faint but unmistakable. Then everything stopped. Linda opened her eyes and smiled, though she looked exhausted. "It's gone," she said, "but you need to stay away from places like that. You might not be so lucky next time." I haven't had the dream since that night, and nothing strange has happened in my apartment, but I still can't bring myself to go near the old hospital. Sometimes, when I drive past it, I feel a pull like it's calling me back. I don't know if it's curiosity or something darker, but I'll never go back inside. Not after what I saw, not after what followed me home. Life slowly returned to normal after the ritual, though I couldn't shake the lingering unease. It was like a shadow on the edge of my mind, a quiet reminder of what I'd been through. I avoided talking about it, even with Rachel, and for the most part, my friends seemed to have forgotten the whole thing. But a few months later, something happened that made my stomach drop. I was scrolling through social media when I saw a post from a local urban explorer. He was known for documenting creepy, abandoned places around town, and his latest upload was titled "Inside the Old Hospital: The Truth About the Rumors." My hand shook as I clicked on it. The video started innocuously enough. Shots of the graffiti-covered walls, the debris-strewn floors, and the crumbling hallways I knew all too well. But when he entered the operating room, I froze. The gurney was still there, as rusted and grimy as I remembered. The room was bathed in the same eerie light, but there was no sign of the figure. At first, the explorer panned his camera around, narrating his findings. When he paused and whispered, "What the hell is that?" The camera zoomed in on the far corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to move. It wasn't like the play of light through broken windows. It was deliberate, purposeful. The explorer laughed nervously, chalking it up to his imagination, and continued filming. But the shadow didn't stay in the corner. As he moved to exit the room, the shadow followed, stretching unnaturally along the wall. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it trail behind him, disappearing whenever he turned around but reappearing when he wasn't looking. The video ended abruptly with the explorer saying, "Alright, that's enough for tonight. This place is giving me the creeps." He laughed, but his voice sounded strained. I couldn't sleep that night. The video confirmed what I already knew. Whatever I'd seen in that hospital was still there. But the worst part, the comments. One person wrote, "I've been there before and I saw something similar. Be careful, it might not stay at the hospital." Another said, "That shadow thing followed me home. Took weeks to get rid of it." My heart sank. I thought I was free of it, but now I wasn't so sure. Had the ritual worked, or had it simply hidden itself, waiting for the right moment to return? Over the next few weeks, little things started happening again. My lights would flicker even when the weather was fine. Doors that I knew I'd locked would be slightly ajar, and the dreams came back, not every night, but often enough to make me dread falling asleep. In the dreams, I wasn't in the hospital anymore. Instead, I was in my apartment, but it didn't feel like my apartment. The air was heavy, and the shadows seemed alive, shifting and moving like they had minds of their own. I'd wake up in a panic, feeling watched. One night, I woke up to the sound of faint humming. My heart stopped. I sat up, straining to hear, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd been dreaming, and the noise lingered as I woke up. But deep down, I knew better. The final straw came a week later. I was sitting on my couch, watching TV, when I saw it in the reflection of the screen. For a split second, I swore I saw a figure standing behind me, its face stretched into that same awful grin. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. there. That was it. I packed a bag and left that night, driving to Rachel's place without even calling ahead. She let me stay, and I told her everything that had been happening. She believed me, but her face was pale as she listened. I think it's time we go back to Linda, she said. I haven't been back to my apartment since. Linda performed another cleansing, this time warning me that the entity might not be tied to a location anymore. It could be tied to me. She gave me a small talisman to wear, something she said would protect me, but her expression told me she wasn't entirely sure. It's been a year now. For the most part, things have been quiet, but every now and then, I catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, or I hear a faint hum when the house is silent. I don't know if it's my imagination or something worse. What I do know is this: some places are better left alone, and if you ever find yourself standing at the threshold of an abandoned hospital, don't go inside. You might not come out the same. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.